Around 1:30 p.m. on the afternoon of May 18th, 2007, a 57-year-old woman named Yvonne de Hoorde arrived at a park in Rotterdam, which is a city in the Netherlands. She was there to meet up with her friend, and she had to cut through the park to get to his house. Yvonne went to her friend's house almost every day. And usually when she walked through the park during the week, there weren't that many people around. But on this day, it was really crowded because it was the Friday of a long weekend, and there was just a lot of families and visitors that were enjoying the spring weather, which meant the playground, the pathways, and the park's little cafe were all packed. But Yvonne didn't pay that much attention to the crowds because she was busy thinking about her friend. They'd known each other for years, and they had what she considered to be a very special connection that Yvonne didn't think she had with anybody else. Now, Yvonne knew that a lot of people might say her and her friend's relationship was sort of more strange than special. In fact, some people in her life actually openly disapproved of it. But for Yvonne, it seemed like the main reason for that was, Yvonne was generally pretty friendly and social and sort of an outgoing, normal person, but her friend was extremely reclusive and never left his house, and so it just seemed like an odd pairing. Her friend was originally from Germany, but even though he'd lived in the Netherlands now for years, he had never learned the language. So he really couldn't communicate with anybody, including Yvonne, at least not in her native tongue. But for Yvonne, if anything, the fact that people didn't necessarily think this was a good idea for them to be friends just made her feel more protective of her friend. And also, she was especially sympathetic to the fact that her friend had actually been abandoned by his mother as a child. And so in a way, she sort of felt like she was stepping in as sort of a maternal figure in her friend's life. And so Yvonne, she rounded a corner on the park's path, and up ahead, there was her friend's house. And she could actually see her friend through one of the windows. And he did not look particularly happy. He looked sort of dejected. And so as she approached, she made a big scene to be very smiley and happy, and she's waving to her friend. And sure enough, her friend at some point turned and looked out the window and saw Yvonne approaching, and he broke into a big smile and he waved back. It's like even though they didn't speak the same language, there clearly was a connection there. And Yvonne was just filled with happiness, so glad that she was here to see him. And so Yvonne, she made her way over to her friend, and that day really was spent the same way they spent all their other days together, which again, they don't speak the same language, so it was just sort of a lot of, body language and gestures and sort of just sitting together and just sort of enjoying each other's company. There wasn't really any direct communication happening, but this was a unique relationship, and for Yvonne, whatever it was enough for her. And she felt like for her friend, it was reciprocated. He appreciated their time together, and that was enough. But even though Yvonne in particular really looked forward to these visits and was having a really nice time on this particular day, she couldn't stay forever. She had a family and other things she needed to get done. So at around 2:30 p.m., after having spent about an hour with her friend, she said goodbye to him, and then she turned and left, knowing that the two of them would see each other again soon. And so Yvonne, after turning and leaving her friend's house, she only got a few steps down the path she came in on when two things happened at once. The first thing was she noticed there was a group of kids in the park who were throwing rocks, and she knew instinctively, like, the kids should not be throwing rocks. So that sort of registered. She wasn't doing anything about it, but she was just aware that there are children throwing rocks nearby. And then the second thing she noticed is she heard splashing coming from behind her. She didn't think it was coming from the kids throwing rocks. She's thinking it didn't rain anytime recently, so there's no reason that there'd be splashing sounds around her. There's no puddles or anything. The only splashing that made sense was it was coming from this stream that was sort of off limits in the park. Nobody had access to it. There was no reason to get down there to that stream, but it sounded very much like that was the splashing that she was hearing. And so Yvonne, she's just consciously aware of these things happening. This was not something that was alarming. She's just aware. And so she found herself turning around to see in particular what that splashing sound was. And as she turned around, something huge smashed into her, pinned her to the ground. All she could hear was screaming throughout the park. And the last thought she had before she blacked out was, "Oh my God, I'm about to die." Not far away, a man named Arvid Hendricks, who had also come to this same park with his wife and his two kids, heard the screams echoing through the park. He was right outside the cafe that Yvonne had been walking towards, and he had just been about to go inside when all this commotion had started. So this particular cafe sat on a path that cut through the park itself. It was a small place, almost like a glorified snack bar, and it had a big pavilion right in front of it with outdoor seating that looked out over the park. And from Arvid's perspective, as he was standing on that pavilion near the cafe entrance, he could hear these people screaming and actually started to see them running in his direction. But Arvid had no idea what they were screaming about or what they were running from. It just seemed like all of a sudden everybody's panicking and coming this way. And so instinctively, Arvid's thinking, okay, there's something threatening going on, and he needs to make sure his family is safe before he even knows what the threat is. So he grabbed his kids and his wife, and he ran into the restaurant along with everybody else. And remember, this restaurant, this cafe, was not huge. Inside, it sort of felt like a dining hall with large communal tables. And so with all these people rushing inside, this place quickly became chaotic. And then after all these people came inside, a few of the people went forward and did their best to barricade the front doors. Even though they were glass and would be pretty easy to break through, they did what they could to sort of block them off. After this, despite there still being this really intense energy sort of buzzing around the room, things actually kind of calmed down. Arvid and probably many other people in this cafe did not know what was going on. They had just sort of reacted instinctively and went in here, assuming there has to be some real threat out there. Let's take shelter. And so there's this weird lull period where everyone's kind of looking around, Arvid included, trying to figure out, is there really a big threat out there, or are we overreacting here? And as they're all sitting there kind of wondering what's going on, the front doors, the glass doors, suddenly shatter. And once again, the whole group is thrust into absolute chaos once again, as all the parents are grabbing their kids, and even though they still don't really know what's going on, they're trying to rush towards those shattered doors to get out of this place, which now feels like it is dangerous, in some ways worse than outside. And so it's this huge bottleneck as the door, as everyone's screaming, there's just madness happening. And Arvid, he could tell there was no way he could get through this cluster of people desperately trying to get out. And so he just grabbed his wife and his kids, and they went under one of the tables and they hid. And for the next couple of minutes, everything all around Arvid and his family continued to be absolutely chaotic and madness. But then eventually, everything just went quiet as everybody else made their way out of the cafe. And it was just Arvid and his family sitting there wondering what the heck is going on. And for a moment, Arvid felt like, okay, I'm safe. I don't know what's going on, but me and my family, we are safe. However, before he instructed his kids and his wife to come out of their hiding spot, he heard the sound of more glass shattering, and then he heard these loud stomping sounds as something huge was making its way through those front doors into the cafe. And suddenly, it hit Arvid when he looked out and saw what it was. Why everybody was running. And he also realized that he and his family were now trapped. It would turn out all the people in Yvonne's life who frowned on her special friendship had been right to do so. Because although Yvonne loved her daily routine with her friend did not actually feel the same way. Every day when Yvonne went to visit, she would sit with her friend and keep him company. And Yvonne's friend would smile back at her. This was sort of the rapport they had developed, at least in Yvonne's mind. The smiling back and forth suggested they were friends. What Yvonne didn't realize is that them smiling back and forth was actually something her friend hated. And on that particular Friday afternoon, her friend was already in a very bad mood. The park that surrounded his house was so crowded and so loud, and those kids who Yvonne saw throwing rocks when she left had been doing it earlier. They were throwing rocks that whole time that she was visiting with her friend, and some of those rocks were hitting her friend's house, and it was making him so agitated and mad. And then the whole time through this interaction, Yvonne is smiling over and over at her friend, thinking this is so great, and it just totally sent her friend over the edge. And so when Yvonne finally left and walked away, the friend, should have felt relieved because now, one of the things that was really agitating him was gone. Yvonne, she was gone. But the friend knew she wasn't really leaving for good. She would just come back tomorrow like she always did with that same enraging smile on top of all the other things that were so annoying. And the friend just could not take it any longer. So he snapped. He stormed out of his house, splashing through that off-limits stream in the park to get to Yvonne as she walked away. And just before he reached her, she turned around and saw him. This time, he smiled at Yvonne before she could smile at him. And for once, she didn't smile back. Instead, she looked terrified. And this was because Yvonne's friend was a 400-pound silverback gorilla named Boquito. And the park he lived in was a zoo. To silverback gorillas, smiling is not a sign of friendship. It's a sign of aggression and hostility. So it's very likely that from Boquito's point of view, almost every day for years, Yvonne had been coming to his enclosure, in essence, to threaten him. At least that's very likely how he interpreted it. And he had been basically threatening her back whenever he smiled by showing his teeth. And he thought maybe that would get her to go away, but it never worked. She always came back and just continued to threaten him. And so eventually, like the story goes, it became too much. Luckily though, Boquito didn't harm really anybody except for Yvonne. He bit her over 100 times and broke multiple bones, but Yvonne did survive. But no other guests were harmed, including Arvid and his family. They were trapped in that cafe with Boquito, who after attacking Yvonne had charged in there and was walking around, but Boquito never attacked. And so at a certain point, Arvid and his family were able to run to safety. After she recovered, Yvonne would tell the media that Boquito was still her darling. That's what she called him. And in fact, she would go back to the zoo to see Boquito after that. But this time, she didn't smile. The next and final story of today's episode is called Off the Bus. At 3 a.m. on August 11th, 1965, a 19-year-old student named Ali Dogan sat in the front seat of a passenger bus as it headed down a dark, narrow road in northwest Turkey. Ali and about 50 other passengers were on their way from the city of Ankara to Istanbul, which is the largest city in Turkey, and they were about 3 hours into a 5-hour trip. Ali had passed the time so far by speaking with the man who just happened to be sitting next to him. He was an Air Force lieutenant. The lieutenant told Ali that originally he had actually been booked to take a flight to Istanbul, but he had missed the flight, and so here he was on the bus. But he told Ali that actually he was really enjoying this bus ride. He had never been on a long bus ride before, and critically, he had scored the very front seat in the bus, so he could basically see out the front window of the bus. And so for him, that was kind of exhilarating. And for Ali, he had actually switched spots with a previous passenger who had been sitting next to the lieutenant when they first boarded. He had switched with that person because Ali, the reason he was switching, was he wanted that view too. And so he and this lieutenant were sort of bonding over their shared excitement over, watching the road as they drove for hours on end. Ali and the lieutenant spoke in very quiet voices since almost everybody else on the bus was fast asleep. But these two, they're pumped, they're watching the road, they're talking about it quietly. But at a certain point, Ali, despite his enthusiasm for this ride, he started to feel pretty drowsy too. Ali was on his way back to Istanbul where he went to college. And later that day, because right now it's 3 a.m., later that day, he had a big exam. And he knew that as much as he wanted to stay up and sort of enjoy the ride, he really needed to get some sleep. So he took his sweatshirt and rolled it up like a pillow, put it behind his head, told the lieutenant he was going to sleep for a bit, and then he put his head back and closed his eyes. However, about 15 minutes later, when Ali was just really beginning to actually fall asleep, the bus was suddenly filled with screams, and Ali, he opened his eyes and he was looking out forward in the direction the bus was going, and he saw these bright headlights bearing down on the bus, and he knew they were about to collide with somebody on the road. And then the bus hard swerved to the right, and Ali's trying to hold on to the partition to keep himself seated. Then he's getting ready to smash into this other vehicle, but right at the last second, the bus turns and slams off the road and comes crashing down in this ditch right off the side of the road. And then the bus kind of lurched to a stop because the bus driver was able to stop the crash. And for a second, Ali's looking around, everyone's so shaken up by this, and he's feeling, very relieved that they did not smash into an oncoming car. But despite feeling that relief Allie quickly realized they had another problem. The bus was starting to fill with smoke. And so Allie and the lieutenant, in virtue of sitting at the very front of the bus, were the closest to the door leading off the bus. And now clearly everybody needs to evacuate. There's some kind of fire that's happening because of the crash they've just been in. And so Allie and the lieutenant, they stand up, and the bus is kind of at a slant here because they're in this ditch. And they go up to the very front of the bus, and they actually look out the cracked front windshield, and they see there's this huge truck also in the ditch on the side of the road. And they're figuring that they must have collided in some way, like that was the truck that forced the bus off the road. And so it's like, okay, they've gotten into this accident. There's clearly a fire. We just got to get off this bus. And so Allie and the lieutenant, they get to the door and they try to open it. But the way the bus kind of crashed into this ditch, it sort of warped the frame of the bus. And so the lieutenant, he got down there and he began smashing on this door to try to open it up. And as this is happening, the smoke is getting much more intense inside of this bus, and all the people on the bus, the 50 some odd passengers behind them, they're starting to panic. Everyone's rushing forward, bumping into Allie and the lieutenant, trying to get off this bus. And then finally the lieutenant, he manages to force open the doors. And the second he does, this additional rush of black smoke comes pouring into the bus. It's like you can't even see anything. Everyone's choking and screaming. And the lieutenant, he just yells to Allie to go, get out, jump out. And so Allie, he's the first one off the bus. He climbs down the steps. All he sees is smoke everywhere. He really has no idea where the fire is actually coming from. And so instinctively, he just jumps out of the bus, just jumps as high and as far as he possibly can. And he actually hits the other side of the ditch. And he kind of stumbles and climbs up and gets away from the bus. And as soon as he did, he turned around and he's looking at the bus. And it's nighttime, but even still in the darkness, he just sees the bus is completely engulfed in all this smoke. He can't quite tell where the fire is. He's thinking, the engine must have caught fire and it's spreading across the undercarriage of the bus, but it's getting so bad. And he's hearing all the people on board desperately trying to get off out that door the lieutenant had forced open. But there's some kind of bottleneck. They're not getting out. It's like they're stampeding towards the front of the bus. People are screaming. It's chaos. And then Allie hears some of the windows being pushed open. People start jumping out the windows. I mean, they are desperate to get off this bus. And at first, what Allie hears are screams of what sounds like desperate and scared people just trying to evacuate. But quickly, those screams, when the folks started coming out of the bus, turned to pure agony. But as Allie is listening to this and watching this disaster unfold, he's thinking, okay, well, the reason they're screaming is because it's possible they could be catching on fire here, or maybe, they're jumping off and breaking bones or getting hurt from leaping out the window, and that's all terrible. But people are getting out of this bus, and before long, they're going to come up and over that side of the ditch, and they're going to join me. Like, these people, they're coming out of the bus. I'm seeing it happen. But all that happened is the screams of agony got louder and louder, and nobody came over that ditch. It was Allie all alone, and he had no idea why. All he sees is smoke, and all he hears is screams. And then at some point, authorities show up, and they clearly are right into the fray, trying to extinguish whatever fire is going on and trying to get people out and away from the bus. But despite this huge effort that Allie's watching happen right in front of him, granted it's obscured by the smoke, still nobody, including the lieutenant, came over the ditch to come be with Allie. He was all alone. But eventually, Allie noticed a few of the authorities that had shown up to assist in this emergency were walking away from the smoke in the bus, carrying what appeared to be bodies. But as Allie stared at these people carrying these bodies, he realized they weren't whole bodies. They were body parts. It would turn out most of Allie's and the rest of the passengers' assumptions about exactly what happened in that crash were correct. The bus they were riding in did swerve after seeing the headlights of an oncoming vehicle. And it did hit that big truck they saw on the side of the road when Allie and the lieutenant first got to the front of the bus and looked out. That was the truck they hit. Now, it was not a head-on collision. It was sort of a glancing blow as the bus swerved to avoid a head-on collision. But that crash sent the bus off the road into the ditch, and it was that crash into the ditch that ultimately prompted all that smoke. But they were all wrong about what was causing that smoke. there was no fire. The truck that the bus narrowly avoided the head-on collision with, but did ultimately strike, causing both the bus to crash and the truck to crash, that truck was a shipping truck, and it was transporting a huge amount of freight to Istanbul. And the collision burst the truck's shipping containers, and so the contents of those containers, the freight itself, poured out into that ditch. And that ditch that basically the bus had landed inside of, that Ali had sort of jumped over on his way to get out of the bus, and that others were sort of falling into when they were coming out of the bus to avoid this, fire, or so they thought. It already had some water in it when that freight entered into the ditch. So the freight and the water combined. And that combination caused a chemical reaction, and that chemical reaction caused the smoke. Because that freight was nitric acid, a highly corrosive, highly toxic liquid chemical that now, despite being diluted by the water in the ditch, had basically filled the ditch. The ditch is now effectively an acid bath that's smoking, giving the impression the bus is on fire. And so all these folks are leaping out of the bus and landing in the ditch, which again is an acid bath, and they're being dissolved by the acid. Ali, when he left the bus first, he leapt out of the bus. He thought there was the fire right there, and he jumped up and out trying to clear the fire. And what he really did is he cleared the acid bath and landed on the other side, avoiding dissolving in the acid. But virtually everybody else in the bus was going right into the acid. And so in the end, of the nearly 50 people on board that bus, 26 literally dissolved to death. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Around noon on January 13th, 2015, 43-year-old Anna Moses was sitting in her office at the University of Texas at Dallas when she heard her cell phone ding inside of her purse. Anna knew she was not supposed to use her cell phone during work, but she had a feeling she'd just gotten a text from someone very special. So Anna kind of discreetly slid her phone out of her purse, and when she looked at the screen, she smiled. Like she'd thought, her boyfriend, Michael Stodnick, had texted her to confirm that they were still on for dinner that night. Just looking at this message gave Anna butterflies. Michael was a business professor at the university where Anna worked, and he was the first man she had seriously dated since her divorce about 2 years earlier. Anna and Michael had been an item now for the last 6 months, but for Anna, who'd previously been married for 15 years, dating still felt very new. She and Michael were both single parents in their early 40s, but this new relationship made Anna feel young again. Anna quickly texted Michael to let him know she was definitely still on for dinner, then she quietly slid her phone back into her purse and got back to work. Anna was the assistant director of strategic planning and analysis at UT Dallas, but that was not her only job. She was also a graduate student pursuing a master's degree in data analytics, so Anna was very busy. But as soon as the clock hit 2 p.m., Anna stood up from her desk and headed upstairs. She knocked on an office door before opening it, but really the knocking was just a formality. The person sitting at the desk inside, University Vice Provost John Workowski, always expected Anna for afternoon tea. When Anna walked in, the 71-year-old administrator greeted her with a smile and called her by a special nickname, Babochka. It meant butterfly in Russian, and hearing it made Anna feel nostalgic for the country where she grew up. Anna sat down across from Dr. Workowski, and right away he handed her a steaming cup of tea. Dr. Workowski had wild gray hair, big glasses, and he always smelled like cigarettes. Anna was not particularly fond of the smell in his office, but she still felt very comfortable with him because over the past 2 years, she'd spent hours in this office confiding to him about her personal life. Dr. Workowski knew things about Anna that most people simply didn't, like that she'd immigrated to the United States in 1998 just to marry her now ex-husband, Bob Moses. He and Anna had met in Russia when Bob was visiting as a tourist. Then they kept in touch through email for months until he finally asked her to marry him. Bob had been Anna's anchor in America, which made their divorce that much more painful for her. Anna and her ex, Bob, were still on very friendly terms, but at this point, Dr. Workowski had really taken over the role of being Anna's rock now. That day, Anna and Dr. Workowski's conversation centered around Anna's 20-year-old son, Igor, who was a student right there at UT Dallas. Anna said she was worried that she and her son might be growing apart. The previous weekend, Igor had driven the 15 miles from his dorm to her home in Frisco, Texas, as he usually did, but Igor had seemed quiet and distant all weekend. It made Anna worry that he had some problem that he didn't want to talk about. Dr. Wachowski sipped his tea, then told Anna she was a great mother and not to worry. Sometimes children, especially adult children, just need some space. He assured her that whatever was going on with him, Igor would eventually tell her when he was ready. Anna sighed and said, you're probably right. Then she finished her tea, gave the doctor a hug, and headed back downstairs to her office. A couple hours later, at around 5 p.m., Anna turned off her computer and grabbed her purse. It was cold outside, in the 30s, so near freezing, so Anna put on her coat and 2 scarves before waving goodbye to her coworkers and walking outside to the parking garage. She got inside of her blue Hyundai sedan and then headed into rush hour traffic. Part of the way home, Anna's stomach began to growl. She was hungry. Anna looked at the clock and saw that it was 5:30, which meant her boyfriend Michael would not be picking her up for dinner for another 2 hours. So she decided to pull off the highway right then and go to a fast food restaurant, a Taco Bell that served Mexican food, and she went through the drive-thru and she bought a chicken quesadilla. Anna was really hungry, but after receiving the food, she didn't eat it in the car. Instead, she just set it on her passenger seat. Anna generally preferred to keep her surroundings really tidy, and so she never ate in her car. It was just too messy. About 15 minutes later, Anna turned into her neighborhood. As she approached her 2-story brick house, she stopped beside her mailbox and rolled the window down to grab her mail. Then she pulled her Hyundai into the garage. Anna shut the garage door behind her, she gathered up her purse, her mail, and her quesadilla, and she got out of the car. She walked towards the door that led into her home, thinking about how excited she was for her date that night with Michael. But as she reached for the doorknob, Anna heard the sound of rustling behind her, followed by a loud clap. Just after 7:30 p.m. on the same day, Michael pulled up to Anna's house, and he noticed all the lights were off, as if Anna was not home. Michael was confused, but he got out of his car and knocked on Anna's front door. When she didn't answer, he called her, but she didn't pick up. Michael thought about going inside. Anna had actually recently given him a house key, but he knew Anna always turned on her alarm system when she left the house, and he didn't know the code to disable it, and he didn't want to set it off and cause a scene in such a quiet neighborhood. Michael began to feel cold just standing outside, so he turned around, went back to his car, and tried calling Anna again. But Anna's phone again went to voicemail. Anna had never missed a date with Michael before, but Michael told himself, Anna was very busy, she was a grad student and a mother, she could have easily gotten sidetracked with any number of things. So even though he was very disappointed, Michael decided to go home and wait for Anna to call him back. He was sure she would explain everything as soon as she could. The next morning at 9 a.m., Michael once again pulled into Anna's driveway. He had continued calling and texting her until 11 p.m. the previous night, but she never responded. Michael even contacted Anna's friends to ask about her, but they too had not heard from her. And so when Michael woke up on this morning with no text or no calls from Anna, the first thing he did was drive to her house. Michael knocked on the front door, and when there was no response, instead of going in, he instead called the Frisco Police Department. He told the dispatcher that he hadn't heard from his girlfriend since the previous afternoon when she was working at UT Dallas, and now he was at her house knocking on her door and she wasn't answering phone calls or text messages, and so he asked if somebody could come out to her house to make sure she was okay. The dispatcher was obviously empathetic, but they told Michael that for this type of thing, protocol was he would need to call the university's campus police first, and then if for some reason they couldn't handle it, then they would ratchet this up to the Frisco Police Department. And so Michael hung up and then looked up the number for the university campus police and called them, and they promised him they would look into the situation right away. Michael thanked them and hung up, and even though he still felt very uneasy about this, he had to get to work. So he got into his car and drove away. Less than an hour later, Frisco Police Sergeant Jay Ream received a call from the University of Texas Dallas campus police. They told Sergeant Ream they were looking for a university employee named Anna Moses. Her boyfriend had just called to request a welfare check, and the campus police had quickly learned that Anna did not show up for work that day. which her coworkers said was highly unusual. Because Anna was not actually living on campus, the university officer asked Reem if he could go check her home in Frisco. Reem said he was on it, and a few minutes later he was out the door, headed towards Anna's address. Reem got there at 10:50 a.m. and knocked on the door. When nobody answered, Sergeant Reem tried the doorknob, but it was locked. Reem knew he could knock down Anna's door, but that seemed extreme. Instead, he called the campus police back and asked if they knew anyone who could let him inside. Over an hour later, at 12:05 p.m., 2 cars pulled up outside of Anna's house. A campus police officer stepped out of one, and Anna's son, Igor, got out of the other. The university police had been able to find Igor on campus, and he told them he had a key and knew the alarm code to his mother's house. Igor nodded curtly at Sergeant Reem, then unlocked his mother's front door and walked inside and disabled the alarm. As Reem entered Anna's home, Igor walked past him and back outside. He did not seem concerned at all about his mother. He just said he'd be out in the car waiting for whenever they were done. Sergeant Reem thought Igor's behavior was strange, but he couldn't worry about that right now. Instead, he and the university police officer walked into Anna's foyer. The house was totally silent except for the officer's footsteps on the tile. They searched the first floor, but they didn't find any sign of Anna, and they were about to head upstairs when the sergeant remembered they should scope out the garage. Reem made his way to the door that led to the garage, and he opened it. And right away, even in the darkness, he could tell Anna's car was not parked inside, making the garage feel very empty. Then he flipped on the overhead light, and he gasped. Anna was lying on her back on the garage floor with blood coming out of her mouth, and there were bullet casings all around her. It was obvious just from looking at her that she was deceased. The university officer came over and looked into the garage too, and instantly brought a hand up to his mouth in shock. Neither of the officers had ever seen anything like this before. Frisco was an extremely safe community with very few violent crimes. It actually had been called one of the safest cities in the entire United States. But that only made Anna's apparent murder that much more shocking. Her quiet suburban home was now a crime scene. Even though he rarely worked homicide cases, Sergeant Reem knew the protocol. First, he and the university officer backed out of the garage and closed the door so they would not disturb any evidence. Then they checked the rest of Anna's home to make sure nobody else was there. Once they confirmed the house was empty, Reem called the Frisco Police Department for assistance. Reem then slowly walked outside towards Igor's car parked by the curb. As he got closer, Igor rolled down the window and looked at the sergeant without saying anything. Once he reached the car, Reem took a deep breath and told Igor that he had terrible news. His mother was dead, and it looked like she'd been murdered. The sergeant watched Igor for a reaction, but the young man's face was blank. Then Igor just furrowed his eyebrows and asked if his mother was in one piece. Sergeant Reem was so surprised by this question that he just said, "Well, yeah." Igor nodded and then said he had to go because he had class. Reem had no idea what to make of Igor's very bizarre reaction. It was so odd, but Igor had just received this life-shattering news, and Reem knew, shock can make people behave in totally inexplicable ways. So for now, Reem decided to give Igor a pass, and he just figured, they would do everything they could to find out what happened to his mother. Then the sergeant heard a siren blaring, and he looked up to see a Frisco PD cruiser heading his way. A few minutes later, Frisco detective Brian Schutte and Texas Ranger Reuben Mankin stood inside of Anna's garage. The two men were from different agencies, but they'd both been assigned to lead the case together. The crime scene made Schutte feel totally sick. He was a very young detective, and this wasn't just the first time he'd be leading a murder investigation. This was his first murder case that he'd ever worked on. Detective Schutte squatted next to Anna's body. She was still wearing a heavy coat and 2 scarves, but he could see a bullet wound in her neck. And scattered on the floor around her were a few unopened envelopes, an empty Taco Bell wrapper, and a black purse. There were also a handful of bullet casings, which the detective identified as coming from a .22 caliber gun. Detective Schutte told Mankin that it seemed like Anna had been outside, which is why she was wearing warm clothes, and she had come in and was carrying her mail, purse, and fast food trash when somebody shot her in her garage. Schutte figured that Anna had likely been killed the previous evening when she came home from work. Ranger Mankin nodded in agreement, but he pointed out that Anna's car wasn't parked in the driveway or the garage, so he wondered if her killer had stolen it. Maybe Anna had been killed during a robbery. But then Detective Schutte opened up Anna's black purse, and it didn't seem like anybody had rifled through it. And Anna's wallet, which contained $300 in cash, was still inside her purse. And the inside of Anna's house also looked totally undisturbed. So if this was a robbery, the only thing the killer stole was Anna's car, which didn't really make any sense. Schutte told Mencken that he really wasn't sure about the robbery theory, it felt kind of weak, but the missing car did give them a good place to start. So Schutte radioed the Frisco Police Department and asked a fellow officer to put out a bulletin about Anna's stolen vehicle. But at the same time, Schutte was thinking to himself that it seemed most likely that Anna had been killed by somebody she knew. After all, the killer had clearly gained access to the garage without breaking in, and the young detective couldn't stop thinking about the very strange statements and behavior of Anna's son, which the local police had briefed him about. Schutte really wanted to interview Igor as soon as possible. Later that afternoon, Detective Schutte sat down across from Igor inside of an interview room at the Frisco police station. Igor looked remarkably calm, and when he spoke, his voice was flat and emotionless. The detective asked Igor to please talk about his relationship with his mother. Igor said that he and his mother had always been very close. They both loved music, and when Igor joined a Christian rock band as a teenager, his mom supported him and came to almost all of his shows. Even now that Igor was living on his own at college, he still went home to visit her every weekend. Anna kind of babied him by doing his laundry and cooking for him, but Igor kind of liked it. But he said seeing Anna divorce his dad had been really difficult. Bob actually was not Igor's biological father. He had adopted him. And so for Igor, he looked at Bob as his father. That was his dad. And when Igor said that, Schutte stopped him because he hadn't realized Bob was not his biological father. But Igor explained that his mother had actually been married twice, once briefly to a man in Russia and then to Bob in the United States. The Russian man was Igor's biological father, but Bob had legally adopted Igor when he was just 4 years old. And as Igor talked about his dad, Bob, he became emotional. Igor said he, personally, Igor, had been diagnosed with a rare form of bone cancer when he was just 8 years old, and his dad had always been there to support him. Igor's cancer eventually went into remission, but the experience showed Igor that Bob genuinely loved him like he was his own son. Detective Schutte couldn't help but feel moved by Igor's story, but he wanted to stay focused on the horrible crime he was still investigating. So he asked Igor if there was anyone who would want to hurt his mother. Igor thought for a moment and then said no. But he added, whoever killed his mother should be forgiven. Igor said he was a devout Christian and he believed all people, even killers, should be treated with mercy. Schutte was shocked. Igor did not seem to care at all that his mother was horribly murdered, but the detective just stared at the college student trying to remain professional and followed up by asking Igor where he'd been the previous evening. Igor said he had been in class from around 5:30 p.m. to 9:45 p.m., and he had classmates who could vouch for him. Schutte did not have any evidence that would allow him to hold Igor any longer, though he still felt very suspicious of him. But despite Schutte's inexperience as a detective, he still knew the worst thing an investigator could do right now was get tunnel vision about one suspect. For now, he knew he needed to explore every possibility, and he knew exactly who he wanted to talk to next. Anna's ex-husband and Igor's dad, Bob. After Schutte told Igor he was free to go, the detective went to his office, and he saw Ranger Mencken had left him a note about the progress in his investigation, and that the medical examiner had sent a copy of Anna's autopsy report over. Mencken's note explained that he'd been able to reconstruct Anna's last day by obtaining security camera footage from UT Dallas, local toll roads, a Taco Bell, and also an elementary school near Anna's house. After reviewing this footage, Mencken estimated that Anna got home from work between 5:50 and 5:55 p.m. on January 13th, and based on the crime scene, he felt certain she was killed almost immediately when she went inside. Next, Schutte looked over the autopsy report that was sent over, which largely supported Mencken's theory about when Anna was killed. The medical examiner said Anna had been shot at close range 6 times. All of the bullets came from the same .22 caliber gun, and the wounds were grouped tightly together, which made the medical examiner think her killer had some level of experience using firearms. But there was one odd detail that really stood out to the medical examiner. The detectives had told him before he did the autopsy that Anna had bought a quesadilla at around 5:30 p.m., which would be less than half an hour before she was killed. And considering they found the empty wrapper for this quesadilla next to her dead body, it suggested she had eaten it. However, when the medical examiner examined Anna's stomach contents, it looked like she hadn't eaten for many hours prior to her death. And if Anna didn't eat that quesadilla, well, according to the medical examiner, it seemed highly plausible that her killer did. Schutte was so disturbed by the idea of somebody who could shoot someone in cold blood 6 times, kill them right in their house, and then pick up their Taco Bell and eat it over their body. It just seems so unbelievably psychotic. And so Schutte called Ranger Mankin and said he knew it was late, but they did not have time to waste. They really needed to dig in right now. So, shortly before midnight on Wednesday, January 14th, Schutte and Mankin knocked on the door of a medium-sized home in Frisco. This is where Bob had been living since his and Anna's divorce. He was renting a room and sharing the home with 3 other men. Bob answered the door. He was wearing pajamas and looked confused to see the police. He asked if everything was okay, and Detective Schutte just said no. They needed to speak with him about his ex-wife, but it would be better if they talked at the police station. But Bob didn't move right away. Instead, he stayed in his doorway and just kept asking, really, what's happening here? Can you tell me anything else? And finally, Detective Schutte said, "I'm sorry, but unfortunately, your ex-wife is dead." As soon as he said it, Bob's face just fell, and he agreed to go with them to the station. Bob's interview began at 1 a.m., so it was now Thursday, January 15th. And it wasn't until Schutte, Mankin, and Bob were actually sitting in the interview room that they told Bob Anna was not just dead, she had been murdered. Bob looked horrified, and his first question was, is Igor okay? The police assured Bob that Igor was fine. Then Ranger Mankin asked Bob where he'd been on the evening of January 13th, the night that Anna was killed. Bob said he'd been home watching TV till about 7 p.m., and then he went out for dinner, and he said his 3 housemates could easily confirm his story. Bob admitted he owned 5 guns, 3 of which were .22 caliber, and he agreed to hand them all over to police for ballistics analysis. And when detectives asked him for a DNA sample, he gave them a swab without any hesitation. Ranger Mankin thanked Bob for his cooperation and told him he was free to go. After Bob was gone, both Mankin and Schutte agreed that Bob did seem honest and seemed genuinely distressed at his ex-wife's death, but they still needed to follow up on his alibi. However, it was super late, nearly 2 a.m., and so Schutte and Mankin decided to call it a day. But just then, Schutte's phone rang. A Frisco Police Department patrol officer told him that they had just found Anna's stolen car in a residential neighborhood a few blocks away from her house, and the patrol officer was pretty sure they could see blood inside. Schutte's heart started to race. He told the patrol officer to make sure nobody touched that car. In the meantime, he would arrange for a tow truck to bring the vehicle to the crime lab for analysis. After a few hours of sleep, Schutte arrived at the Frisco Police Department crime lab early on Thursday morning. Anna's blue Hyundai sedan was there, and a technician was waiting to brief the detective on what they'd found. The technician said the vehicle was remarkably clean inside, except for a few things. There was an empty Red Bull energy can, there was a cigarette butt, and there were 2 small bloodstains, one on the right side of the driver's seat and one on the center console. Schutte was really excited at this news. And so he had the can, cigarette, and swabs of the blood sent off for DNA testing, along with the swab that Bob had given them during his interview. But Schutte knew it could take weeks to get these results back, so for now, he still had to continue with old-fashioned detective work. The most obvious person to interview next was Anna's boyfriend, Michael. He agreed to come in for an interview, and soon Schutte was sitting across from the business professor at the police station. Michael leaned forward and ran his hands through his short brown hair. He looked anxious. And before Schutte even began the interview, Michael asked if he should have a lawyer. The detective promised him this was all totally routine. Michael picked at his fingernails as he told Schutte that he and Anna had not been dating for very long, but their relationship had been moving in a good direction. He said a few days ago, on January 13th, he'd gone to Anna's house to pick her up just after 7:30, and he'd been confused by her absence. And now he was horrified to know Anna had been lying dead in her garage the entire time he was there. Once Michael began talking, he started to open up a bit more, but as soon as Schutte asked him for a DNA sample, he clammed up. Then he asked again about maybe getting a lawyer. The detective said that really wasn't necessary, but he would give Michael some time alone to decide whether he wanted to cooperate. Schutte left, but what Michael didn't know was that the detective could still see and hear Michael through a camera in the corner of the room. So Schutte watched as Michael began mumbling to himself. The detective could not make out all the words, but at one point, Michael asked himself, "Am I overreacting?" A few minutes later, the detectives went back in and asked Michael if he had made a decision. Michael said yes. He said he would give a sample of his DNA. Schutte smiled, and then he got the swab from Michael and told him he was free to go. Then Schutte sent this newest DNA sample to be tested against the other items from Anna's car. While they waited for the DNA results, Detective Schutte and Ranger Mankin interviewed some of Anna's friends and co-workers. And quickly, the investigators soon learned that Bob and Michael were not the only men in Anna's life. Anna's friends pointed detectives towards a man named Jerry Caspel, a poet who they said had a deep spiritual bond with Anna. Her co-workers also mentioned a vice provost at UT Dallas named Dr. John Warkowski, who seemed to be Anna's mentor. Detective Schutte contacted Jerry first, and when he arrived for his interview, he was totally overwrought and on the brink of tears. He told the detective that Anna was his muse, and without her, he didn't know if he'd ever be able to write poetry again. Schutte narrowed his eyes at Jerry's very melodramatic display, but he let him keep talking. Jerry explained that he met Anna at a public speaking course a few years back, and they'd bonded over their love of art. They often went to the opera together, and Anna would read and edit Jerry's poems. He'd published 2 books of poetry and dedicated them both to her. Schutte thought this connection sounded very intense, so he asked Jerry what Anna's boyfriend thought about them being so close, and Jerry looked surprised. He said he didn't even know Anna had a boyfriend. But regardless, he insisted their relationship was not romantic, it was purely spiritual. The detective found the whole tale pretty hard to believe. He asked Jerry if he owned any firearms, and Jerry said yes, he had a .22 caliber handgun. But he quickly agreed to let the police analyze it, and he also gave them a DNA sample. Next, Schutte asked where Jerry was around 6 p.m. on January 13th. Jerry said he was driving home from work on a Dallas toll road that was very far away from Anna's home, and the toll records would certainly reflect that. Schutte thanked Jerry, and as soon as the poet left, Schutte just shook his head. It did not seem like Jerry was a viable suspect. So he called the next man on his list. A few days later, Detective Schutte began to interview Dr. John Warkowski. The university administrator explained that he met Anna through work, and they grew very close during her divorce. Then, Dr. Warkowski said something surprising. He told the detective that he and Anna once had an affair. Schutte stared at the man, who was 70 years old, making him 27 years older than Anna. Dr. Warkowski said he knew that he and Anna seemed like an unlikely pair, but it really was true. He said Anna wanted to have a relationship with him, and he had to cut it off because of their age difference. It just seemed totally inappropriate. But they still remained close friends, and so Dr. Warkowski knew very intimate details about her life, like how she struggled emotionally and financially after her divorce. Dr. Warkowski said he considered it his privilege to help Anna with money. In fact, in the 2 years since her divorce, he'd wired her a total of $46,000 US. Dr. Warkowski insisted this money was given as a gift with no strings attached, but Schutte was not convinced. He wondered if maybe, during one of their intimate conversations, Anna had learned something about the administrator that he wanted to keep hidden. What if those gifts were actually hush money payments? Or maybe he was paying Anna for sex, and she was threatening to expose him. Thinking about the items found in Anna's car, Schutte asked Dr. Warkowski if he drank energy drinks or smoked cigarettes. Dr. Warkowski said he didn't like energy drinks, but he definitely smoked. And when the detective asked for his whereabouts on the evening of January 13th, the administrator said the same thing Jerry did. He was driving home from work on a toll road that was far away from Anna's home, and certainly the records would reflect that. Schutte made a note of this, but unlike Jerry, he didn't think this let Dr. Warkowski off the hook. So Schutte asked the administrator if he'd be willing to give a voluntary DNA sample. Dr. Warkowski said he was happy to do anything that would help the police solve this case. So he let the detective swab the inside of his cheek before he left the police station. At this point, Detective Schutte felt like he had 5 strong suspects: Anna's son Igor, her ex-husband Bob, and her boyfriend Michael, plus the poet Jerry, and the university administrator Dr. John Warkowski. They all claimed to have alibis, however, none of them had been corroborated yet. Detective Schutte briefed Mankin on everything he discovered about these suspects, and Mankin agreed that they couldn't rule any of them out quite yet. Shortly after that, the detectives got disappointing news from the ballistics analysis on Bob and Jerry's guns. None of the guns matched the one that killed Anna, so they still didn't have the murder weapon. Schutte sighed. Until he got the DNA results and Mencken finished investigating their suspects' alibis, he had no other leads to pursue. But Detective Schutte didn't want to just sit around waiting for other investigators to do their work, so he started wondering if maybe he should go back to Anna's house and have another look around. Police had done an initial search, but there was always a chance something got missed. So Schutte obtained a search warrant, and in late January, about 2 weeks after Anna's murder, he returned to her home. When he got there, he saw there were 2 cars parked outside. So he went up to the door and knocked, and was surprised when Anna's ex-husband, Bob, answered the door. Igor was standing just a few feet behind him. It turned out the father and son had moved into Anna's home a couple weeks ago, 1 day after her body was found in the garage. This struck the detective as a very strange thing to do, but Bob quickly explained that he and his son were grieving together. And because Igor lived in a college dorm and Bob lived in a house with 3 other men, Anna's home was the only private place they could go to. Schutte said that did make sense. However, even though they wanted private time, he held up a search warrant and said he needed to come inside. So Bob immediately opened the door wide and said, "Come on in." The first thing Schutte did is he went into Anna's home office. There, he dug through her desk drawers until he found something that stopped him in his tracks. It was a copy of Anna's life insurance policy. Anna had taken out a policy worth $750,000 US, and she had named one person as the sole beneficiary, her son, Igor. Suddenly, it looked like Igor, whose behavior had struck investigators as very odd from the onset, stood to gain a lot from his mother's death. Then Schutte managed to jimmy open a locked drawer in her desk, and he found something even more interesting. It was a handwritten letter, mostly in Russian. He couldn't understand what it said because he didn't speak Russian, but he figured it must contain something very private since Anna had kept it in a locked drawer. Schutte quietly slid the letter into an envelope and then left the desk and finished searching the rest of the house. He didn't find anything else in the house of note, and so after he left and got back to the police station, he sent a copy of that letter to the FBI so an agent who spoke Russian could translate it for him. In early February, Detective Schutte received a translation of that letter from Anna's desk, and suddenly, Anna's murder started to make a lot more sense. Anna had written this letter herself about one of the police's suspects, and it cast her connection to this man into a totally new light. Next, Ranger Mencken reported back that he had checked out all 5 men's alibis, and he'd been able to verify all of their stories except for one of them. The person whose alibi could not be confirmed was also the same person Anna had written about in her letter. And finally, Schutte got the results of the DNA analysis. DNA from the Red Bull can and cigarette butt in Anna's car did not match any of the suspects, and it didn't match anybody in their criminal database. But those bloodstains found in Anna's car did match a suspect, the same one who did not have an alibi and who Anna wrote about. And so, based on this evidence, along with further investigation into this primary suspect, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Anna Moses when she returned home from work on January 13th, 2015. Late that afternoon, Anna's killer crouched in a corner of her garage, clutching a .22 caliber rifle. He'd been able to slip inside a few minutes earlier because he knew the code to open the garage. Now he was waiting for Anna to get home. Just past 5:50 p.m., the killer heard the sound of the automatic garage door sliding open. Light began to fill the dark garage, and so as it did, he pressed his body back against the wall, trying to be as small and out of sight as possible. He watched as Anna pulled her car inside. The garage door shut, and the killer heard Anna's car door open and then close. Then he listened to her footsteps as she walked towards the door to her house. But before she could open it, the killer stood, raised his gun, and fired 3 shots into her back. Anna spun around in shock. She dropped her mail, purse, and the quesadilla she'd been carrying but not eating. Before she could say anything, the killer fired 3 more shots. 2 hit Anna in the chest, and the other hit her in the neck. Anna crumpled to the ground with blood flowing out of her mouth. Anna's killer slowly lowered his rifle and walked towards her. He watched her chest for any sign of movement, but it wasn't moving. She was not breathing. So he picked up her car keys off the floor and was about to get into her car when he saw the uneaten chicken quesadilla on the floor. So he picked it up, ate it right next to her body, and left the wrapper behind. The killer then got into Anna's car, opened up the garage door again, backed out, and shut the door as he drove away. But he didn't realize that he had a cut on his right hand, and it was leaking blood onto Anna's car seat and center console. The following evening, the killer abandoned the blue Hyundai in a neighborhood a few blocks away from Anna's home, and as law enforcement investigated Anna's murder, her killer did his best to appear very cooperative. He agreed to be interviewed, and he agreed to give a swab of his DNA. But at the same time the killer was kind of putting on this act, in the background, he was doing everything he could to profit off of Anna's death. And that's what police understood as soon as they read the translation of that Russian letter. It was a note that Anna had written to her lawyer in 2013 during her divorce from Bob, and she told her lawyer that Bob was now threatening to kill himself and frame Anna as his murderer just so her son, Igor, would hate her. When Detective Schutte read this, he realized Anna and Bob's divorce was not nearly as amicable as people thought. In fact, the couple had a long history of problems. In 2008, Anna visited a counselor after learning Bob had an affair. She wanted to leave him, but said she felt indebted to him because of how much he'd helped her during Igor's cancer battle. And years later, Anna had called one of her close friends crying, saying she had locked herself in a closet because she was afraid Bob was going to kill her. Anna hid these ugly realities about Bob from her son because she knew her son loved Bob. Bob was the only father figure Igor had ever known, and Anna didn't want to damage that relationship, even if it meant she had to act friendly towards a man she feared. But Bob was angry that Anna divorced him, and he was filled with jealousy over Anna's relationship with Michael. Adding to Bob's bitterness, Anna got total ownership of the large 2-story house they used to share. Bob claimed that at the time Anna was killed, he was at home watching TV, but his housemates told police they did not remember him being home at that time. And while none of Bob's guns matched the murder weapon, he was a military veteran with experience using guns. And so police believe Bob must have taken apart the murder weapon and hid or destroyed the pieces. And if police had any doubts that Bob was the killer, well, the DNA evidence totally erased those doubts. It was clearly Bob's blood inside of Anna's car, likely from a cut on Bob's right hand that he had bandaged by the time he met with police. On February 26, 2015, Detective Schutte and Ranger Mankin arrested Bob at Anna's home. Bob maintained his innocence and pleaded not guilty at his trial. Bob's defense argued that there were too many unanswered questions in Anna's murder, like whose DNA was on the Red Bull can and the cigarette butt found in Anna's car. But the prosecution argued that Bob may have planted this evidence just to confuse investigators. In the end, a jury found Bob guilty of murder, and a judge sentenced him to life in prison. Bob would appeal his conviction in 2018, but an appeals court upheld the jury's original ruling, and to this day, Bob remains incarcerated. Thank you for listening to the Mrballen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, Mrballen Podcast, and we also have Mrballen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just